Hello there, and welcome back to the Closet Historian and back to my sewing parlor for another project. And as I said recently while working on the iridescent taffeta skirt project, this year I'm trying to take some of my most special fabrics that I have squirreled away in my stash that I've put aside for safekeeping and actually pull them out and put them to use. So today I'm diving into a project I intend to pair with that last skirt using a metallic teal and iridescent lurex jacquard. And yes, you heard that right, another metallic iridescent fabric from me. But again, to the surprise of nobody, this project bloomed a little bit bigger, or at least took a little bit longer than I had originally intended, so we better go ahead and get started. And I'm actually going to begin today by pulling out the pattern I used to make the yellow silk jacket I made a couple of years ago here on the channel. I can put a card up to this video here. I am going to be using the same sleeve pattern from that jacket for this new jacket today. So despite making a new pattern, I will be referencing this old one as well. I knew I wanted to stick with a style I really liked just because this fabric I'll be working with today is truly fabulous, and I wanted to make sure I would love the resulting garment. So I'll just take out some of the pattern pieces from the first style to reference as I work on the new jacket today, and I begin with a tracing of my front bodice block, and I will go ahead and draw in the darts here, even though I'll be moving them around and changing things into a style line, into a princess seam here. Now, because this is going to be a jacket, something I might wear a thin blouse or t-shirt underneath, I am going to go ahead and tip up the shoulder 1/4 inch and then out 1/4 inch and then lower the arm side about 3/8 of an inch to a 1/2 inch here. But I am just eyeballing these little modifications that I always like to do for jackets, and I will actually add on 1/4 inch along the side seam of both the front here and then when I work on the back as well, just to give myself a little bit more ease in this garment. I'll be using this sort of grown-on, tipped-up stand collar neckline that I've used on many garments here on the channel over the last few years, and I'll just trace this version that is on this older jacket pattern. This one is rather tall and extends far out onto where like my neck would be. That's because it's meant to fold back into a collar. I am going to reduce the size of that just a little bit here, bringing the height down and actually bringing it about 1/4 inch closer to my neck as well. So that's the modification I'm making here. Just changing things up on the fly, which is sort of the nature of the game today. And I'm going to draw that down into the apex because this is going to be where my center front panel will be, and all of the fit on the front will be controlled with this new style line. The neckline on the silk jacket that I'm referencing does go all the way up to the top of my block pattern. I am going to lower the center front panel a little bit today to give this a sort of peaked and notched sweetheart neckline that you can see in my sketch here on the right. And I have added a 1/2 inch along the center front as well, just because that's going to need seam allowance, as this will not be cut on the fold. It will have a center front hook and eye closure, or hook and bar closure, depends on what I have in stock in the drawer. And making a few more decisions here, I'm going to actually tilt this waist dart towards the center, move it over about 1 inch, and as always, I'm rotating that from the apex. But before I cut this apart into the new princess seam, I just wanted to angle this dart leg, angle that style line towards the center front of the waist a little bit further. And I'm going to kind of give myself a little bit of a sketch in, slight indication of where the second style line will hang out in the front of the bodice here. The second style line, it's not a princess seam, it doesn't control fit in any way, so hopefully you'll see that as I continue on through this process here. Clearly I'm pausing to label some stuff, but I actually do want to cut this apart and start working on this first princess seam before I draw in the second style line. Cut up the dart leg to the apex. This is going to be our new hinge point here. And I will go ahead and close up the side dart, throwing all of my dart fullness into the waist at this point, or into the style line itself. Hopefully you can see we've added on to the angle here now. I will cut the waist dart away as well, and so now all 52 degrees of my personal dart fullness is sitting here at this waist dart. And I'll just clean up my side seam a little bit here, smooth that off, and tape off my floop on the back. Now you can see the dart fullness is sitting in this style line. I will eventually, of course, separate that entirely and then add seam allowance to either side, but I just wanted to draw in this second style line first, which it's much easier to sketch in and decide upon that second style line now that this side is closed up and perfectly smooth for me. But I'll just sketch in a second curve here. This kind of looks like a double princess seam in the end, although again, only one is really controlling the fit. The other is just here for style reasons, because this other one does not cross through the apex. That's how you know it's not the one controlling the fit here. But I will need to add notches so I can reline all of this up later, so I'll go ahead and do that. And then I need to add seam allowance to both of these style lines, or all 3 of these style lines, as it were. And I am listening to a DJ set and rocking out while doing this. And I will link to that DJ set in the description below for you if you're wondering what I am jamming out to while I'm doing this pattern drafting today. Gotta get the energy up somehow here in hibernation season. I mean, we had a nice spring-ish day a couple days ago, but since then it's been back to overcast and slightly snowy for the rest of the week. And honestly, with how dark the rest of the world is, I kind of just feel like sleeping through it, which as we know is not the answer. But these are the main 3 pieces of the front of my jacket here, like so. You can again see where that dart fullness ended up, where that fit fullness is chillin'. And I will go ahead and start working on the back. Of course, I will need a tracing of my basic bodice block back as well, and I need to make those same modifications that I made to the shoulder tipping up and out at the shoulder tip, and then also adding on that lowered arm side and a little bit of ease along the side seam. And before I start drawing in any style lines here on the back, I just want to mark on the shoulder where my seam lines are going to interact with the front, just so I have those match up where need be. And you can see I have this extra sheet of paper here on the left that will come into play later on for a decorative extra yoke that'll be going across the back of this jacket. But before then, I just need to trace in the collar from that silk jacket again, and then modify it for this version. I do need to tilt out my center back a tiny bit for the very top third or so of this, just to give myself a little bit more room at the back of the neck with this high collar. But otherwise, I'm making those same modifications like I said, tilting my shoulder tip, adding on that 1/4 inch of ease to the side seam, and lowering that arm side 3/8 of an inch. I will of course need this to have seam allowance along the center back, since I modified the straight line to have that little bit of a tip out at the top, so I'm adding on a 1/2 inch there. And similar to how I designed the style lines on the front to tip in towards the center of the front waist, I'm going to do the same with the back here. Again, shifting the dart leg positions to be angled a little bit more towards the center, hopefully just exaggerating the hourglass nature of this jacket in general. I'm all about that very old-fashioned new look Dior silhouette over here, as we know. And here on the back, I will be fudging things a little bit, especially up here with this shoulder dart. So as I'm drawing in this style line here, it doesn't interact with the pivot point of this shoulder dart, but it's also within 1/2 inch. So I'm just going to redraw the dart along this new style line, and I'll cut it away. And this is not the official way to eliminate this dart up here, but I felt like it was close enough that I could get away with just, again, fudging it. So do as I say and not as I do, unless I'm telling you to break the rules, in which case maybe don't even do that. You know, I know where I can bend the rules at this point with my body and with making things for myself. But if you haven't obsessively been making little dressmaker suit jackets for the last 3 years for yourself, you know, perhaps be a little more cautious than I'm about to be. And I did want to kind of indicate for myself where I wanted this yoke seam to be. I wasn't sure if I wanted it to be a seam in these pieces or if I wanted to have that additional layer. I'm kind of designing on the fly here, designing as I draft, making decisions as I go. So this is a creative and kind of free-flowing process, I suppose. I'm making new decisions as I go, changing up my sketch even as I go to see what something might look like, or trying to approximate in my head what something might look like. But as I draw in these style lines, things about the design will shift. But I'll cut away the shoulder dart and the waist dart as I separate this into the style line. And unlike the front, I haven't added in any additional style lines yet, but you might notice that there is one on the sketch, and that's because this sketch is the final version, and I will eventually add that in. But here I am putting in some notches for myself so that I can keep track of these things later when I'm sewing the project back together, once this is all cut out of fabric. But of course, now that I've added in a seam line, I need to add in seam allowance because I'm a seam allowance girly. So let me go ahead and do that before I forget, because I'll never remember when cutting something out to add seam allowance. That's way beyond my level of focus and concentration, sadly enough. I could not rely on myself to remember that sort of thing. But here I am thinking maybe I do want to add in another seam down this side panel on the back so that it's 3 pieces across each side of the back. Since there are 6 panels on the front, 3 on each side, maybe it would be nice to echo the same in the back and have 3 panels on each side again. This again will be another style line that is only here for style reasons and not for fit reasons. There's no reason to add this to improve fit in any way or change the fit in any way. Though I do think that a straight seam line like this can add a tiny bit of extra structure, just because along this seam, it's not like I'm going to be adding boning in, although I certainly could, but just having that little bit of seam allowance in there is technically an extra layer of fabric and adds a tiny bit more structure along the seam. Of course, that sort of thing would depend highly on what fabric you're using, interlinings, and all that jazz. And I am trying to remember to label things and indicate grain line as I go. for these pieces, though of course the nice thing about alphanumeric paper is because there is that grid of letters and numbers on there, it kind of preserves what the original grain line you had lined your tracing up with, at least if you remember to trace your bodice blocks using the grid of the alphanumeric to start with. Anyhow, in order to create the decorative yoke piece, the additional layer that will be going across the back shoulder of this jacket, I have another sheet of paper here and I will trace the top half of both of these back pattern pieces, seeing as this extra decorative piece will have to span over the rest of the jacket, I suppose. So I have my center back piece and my side back piece here. And I added on a good 3/8 of an inch to the hem of these. Just wanted these to be a little bit longer, like so. And then I'm going to exaggerate the tips at the back. So right here, before I add seam allowance, I'm going to straighten this off so there's a tiny bit of extra flare in between these two pieces. And then I'm going to add a tiny bit of flare at the back as well. In the end, this will mean that this piece cups out over my back a little bit. You could, depending on how you tacked it down or patted it out, make that tip out at the center back or along each side. And I'm going to have it kind of cup over each of my shoulder blades. You'll see that in the next video. Spoiler alert, this will be a 2-part project. I'm so sorry. I'm extra sleepy and slow right now, and honestly, the cats are extra interruptive and cuddly, and I don't like pushing away a cuddly cat, because a cuddly cat is one of the most important things in the universe. Anyhow, I have gone ahead and added a little bit of flare and curve to the center back here. You'll see the shape that creates in the very end. You could exaggerate that if you wanted to have an even more weirdly shaped back, shoulder peplum thing, which, if you have seen, for example, the recent Schiaparelli Couture show, you can really exaggerate a jacket into some very strange peaked and beaked shapes. And of course, I do highly recommend watching the latest Schiaparelli Couture show, because goodness do they make some magic over there, and honestly, I'm a little bit jealous of the amount of resources and fun they get to have. Anyhow, I will cut these two pieces out, but I don't want to actually keep this seam, so I will go ahead and layer it closed. I did need to smooth this off just a little bit more, so I'm going to tape on a little bit of extra paper, and again smooth this off. And I did cut away the collar on this second piece, which was a new decision. A decision I made while working here on the pattern. So I modified my sketch afterwards, because I didn't want to have 2 layers of collar on the additional yoke piece and on the under jacket, because that was going to get too bulky up there where a lot of fiddly sewing needed to happen anyhow. So we're not doing 4 layers at a tiny little peaked corner like that. I can hardly handle 2. I will now start working on the lower half of the jacket, which will only be connected to the bodice at the very center front. I'll show you that as we continue on here. But I've traced a copy of the top of my A-line skirt pattern for this. This A-line little peplum pattern I keep around here for making jackets. It is just my regular basic block skirt pattern with the waist darts closed into the corresponding flare. And if you'd like to see me create the classic A-line skirt pattern using my basic skirt blocks, I will link that video in a card here. But I want to make sure that I'm lining these panels of the peplum up with the panels of the bodice itself. So I'm going to take the front pattern pieces and mark where those panels will interact with the skirt along the waistline here, just so I can make decisions based on where those style lines land, seeing as I want them to match up when I'm sewing later. And speaking of Schiaparelli, I did want to have this jacket scoop out and peak quite far here on the front. A lot of the jackets in their recent show, which obviously I have found quite inspirational here, were made to look as if someone had thrown on a blazer backwards. So a lot of their exaggerated shaping they had going on was keeping that in mind, but I just liked the very sharp pointed peaks, which I consider much more of a Thierry Mugler sort of thing. But of course, I'm sure Daniel Roseberry over at Schiaparelli has also watched all of the old Thierry Mugler shows, because which of us who admire couture hasn't? And the finishing feather jackets over at Schiaparelli really reminded me of the kind of chimera feathered stuff that Mugler did back in the late 1990s. Like all fashion does tend to be, it's references building upon old references building upon references. But I've gone ahead and drawn in the style lines, the paneling that I want across this center front as well. And anywhere that you have a straight across line, you can layer those things closed. So if these lines up here at the waist are pretty straight, you can layer them on top of the bodice pieces and eliminate that waist seam. My side pieces tend to stay pretty curved, so I never bother trying to eliminate the side waist seam, but at the very center front, I will be able to do that layering. But before anything else, I will go ahead and cut these apart and add seam allowance to either side, again before I forget. I already have seam allowance built into the side seam and waist of that block peplum pattern, but I still need to add it in anywhere I have cut that pattern apart. Of course, the more dramatic your pointy bits, the more slightly irritating they are to sew and the more curves you will have to clip in the end. But we're making a rather couture-inspired jacket today, so I'll put in the effort for my floopy floops. The cat has been asleep on top of my arm for at least an hour now, and I do worry about my circulation, I'm not gonna lie. And here I am layering that center front peplum piece along the waistline of the center front bodice piece and closing that up, eliminating the waist seam for that very center front panel. Just because it was easy enough to do it, so why the heck not? Though it does mean I will have to construct the rest of the jacket before I can sew on that final front piece. And that's how that yellow silk jacket you saw at the beginning was constructed as well. So I'm calling back to that one. And I will follow a similar set of operations for drafting the back skirt pieces for this jacket. Again, tracing the top third or so of my back A-line skirt pattern. And something I forgot to mention on the front is that I did add that 1/4 inch along the side seam. Because I've added that ease to the bodice, I will need it on the skirt side seam as well. And I have marked the hem length that I chose for the front along this side seam for the back, so that will match up in the end. And I'm just referencing my back pieces again to make sure that I will continue these style lines down to the skirt where I want them, like so. Although the jacket itself up on the bodice has a center back seam and this back skirt portion will not. I'm going to have this overlap at the center back with these little pointy bits. So I'll have actually this peplum section for the center go past the center back into the other side and overlap and overlay, like you can see in the sketch here. Basically trying to replicate this sketch in reality, unless for some reason I change my mind while doing the drafting, which, as previously established, does happen. But I'll just sketch in what I think I want here. This will change several times. Again, when you're drafting at home, use pencil, but when I'm drafting for camera, I use marker so that the camera can pick it up. And I'll add some seam allowance along this seam on this side because I know where I want it to end to line up with the style line, and in order for it to do so, I will need that seam allowance. Cut away this swoop here. Now I could leave this as is. It would fit perfectly fine, but I am going to add a seam and a tuck here on this lower skirt portion of the jacket as well. Again, I decided, oh, I like that length, so I better, if I wanted to finish at that length, I need to add seam allowance. So that's what I've done here. All right, so once again, referencing the style lines for the back of the bodice, I want to go ahead and draw in an angled line here, like so, looking at my sketch for reference. But then I realized, oh, I want this to mirror the angle that I drew on the other side. So instead of just sketching in something willy-nilly, I decided to go with the angle that I created on the first side of this so that it would mirror itself. Hopefully that makes any sense. You can see what I'm doing. I'm folding the paper over in order to echo that same angle over here. Like so. Try to keep the seam lines from going straight into the points as well, which is something I had done on the silk jacket, but makes sewing a little bit more bulky. So I'm trying to avoid having seam lines interacting at the points. And I will cut this apart and then add seam allowance in order to sew it back together. Again, style lines just being added for style reasons at this point, although I am going to add a little bit of a curve onto this seam, which will make this peplum cup over the bum a little bit further. So I've just added a little bit of extra ease, extra curve, bulging the seam allowance out less than 1/4 inch perhaps, along the center of this seam line, and that will add again a bit of extra convex curve to this jacket peplum. And I will add that same kind of curve to the seam allowance on the other side as well. And I did just add in a little tuck there at the waist. Hopefully you saw that. I did not get good footage of that because my camera cut away. But here I am curving the other side of the seam allowance. Hopefully you can see what I mean. I will walk this seam with you in a moment as well. And you can see that extra tuck that I've added at the waist. That will line up with the other style line of the bodice back, like so. So this kind of curves outwards, and again, will cup up over the bum, like so. Exaggerating again the hourglass shape of it all. If you make the shoulder and the skirt wider, then the waist looks smaller. It's all optical illusion over here in fashion land. But seeing as I was using the sleeve pattern from the other silk jacket, that means I am finished with my pattern drafting for today and I can start cutting everything out. And for this project, I will be using the remnants of the iridescent silk taffeta that I used to make that skirt earlier in the year. I'll be using some of this for lining some bits and using it as embellishment on this jacket. But I'll be cutting out the jacket itself from this iridescent jacquard, iridescent metallic jacquard. It has both metallic teal, sort of a turquoise thread, a standard turquoise and black thread, and then also a highly metallic iridescent lurex thread running through it. This is a very flashy fabric, probably was dead stock from the late 80s or the 1990s, just based off the fact that I pulled it out of the basement at Allen's in Denver, which is a shop full of dead stock fabrics and lots of other treasures in Denver that I sorely miss now that I am very far away. But I've had this fabric sitting in my stash for several years. I originally picked it up to work on something for verdigris that never came to be. And this fabric definitely fell into the mental category of too pretty to use, which means, of course, I'm now forcing myself to use it this year as I'm trying to do some serious stash busting. But this is just a poly lurex blend. It is almost 50% lurex, I would say, at least, if not more. And this is a true jacquard, meaning that it is reversed on either side. So one side has a little bit more of the teal metallic, and the other side has more of the iridescent lurex, more of that beetle wing finish that we all know I love so very dearly. But I went ahead and cut everything out of the jacquard and a muslin interlining, and then I hand basted all of the pieces together with way too much help from the cats. This took way longer than it should have just because of the constant interrupting, but I'm just too much of a softie to lock them away up in a bedroom, when honestly I probably should. And while I'm not doing any color blocking with the paneling across the front and back of the jacket, I will have the center panel on the fronts of the right side of the fabric, and then the rest of the jacket will be cut with the wrong side of the fabric out, because the wrong side of the fabric is the more iridescent side of this, and therefore the side that I wish most to be seen. And I did actually use a whip stitch for the basting work on this as opposed to a straight stitch, just because I wanted to help contain the fraying of it all. This being a primarily lurex fabric, it did want to fray quite a bit, so I was trying to be extra careful, and I went ahead and whip stitched all the edges as a way of containing them. And with even my sleeves basted together, I can go ahead and sew the underarm seam in my fashion fabric here. That's an easy one. I'll set that over by the machine, even though I won't be getting back to setting these sleeves in for a whole nother video. Either I'm getting slower with age, or I'm just improving my technique and that's why it takes longer. We can decide which of those it is, or if it's a combination of both. But I can press open the seam allowance on my underarm seam here. I did end up using a muslin press cloth for most of the pressing on this project, just because, again, lurex is just plastic and I didn't want to melt it with my iron, but I did want to have the iron hot enough that it would give me steam. So it was a compromise to just go ahead and use a press cloth to make sure I didn't melt anything. And because I knew I was going to be setting these sleeves into the main body of the jacket and setting the lining sleeves into the body of the lining before I put the lining and the fashion fabric shells together, I did go ahead and press the hems of each sleeve cuff up the 1/2 inch of seam allowance as well, in preparation for later hand stitching the lining to the fashion fabric at the cuffs. And as I started to try and sew together the back seam on the decorative yoke, you could see just how much trouble I was having with the very affectionate Oliver getting anything done this last week. Come on, buddy. Let a girl pin 4 inches of seam. And instead of muslin, I did just use some silk organza for that piece, just to keep things nice and thin. But I've interlined all the rest of these pieces with the unbleached cotton muslin that I am so very fond of, and that always smells so good when you press it. But I'll line up my back side seams here, just because after all of that cutting out and basting, it feels so good to start sewing a few seams. And it was a joy that would be short-lived, because I'm about to start working on the embellishing for this jacket as well, which is, again, what took so much extra time. Again, just using that press cloth. When working with this very metallic lurex fabric, it is super iridescent and just so pretty. It's going to make me feel like some sort of a peacock feather beetle situation when I'm done, or at least that's the idea. But because I want to add a lot of embellishment along the center back of this jacket, I was constructing the back first, again under Oliver's watchful gaze. So I went ahead and sewed my center back seams so I could start working on the first round of embellishment for the back of this, which of course is to use my favorite twisted strip method, which is a favorite of so many. Honestly, this is a technique that gets used by every fashion student at least once or twice, and was perhaps most famously used on some of Cersei Lannister's costumes in the final seasons of Game of Thrones. But I've made myself some ribbons of the jacquard, and I've lined those in the iridescent taffeta, so that when my strips are turned up for texture in the end here, I will have the iridescent shine of it all showing. Because surely this metallic iridescent jacquard is not enough all on its own. We have to add even more texture, right? That's kind of the idea here. But just like I did on the purple silk jacket, little short sleeve jacket I made last year, I'm going to layer strips of this down the center back. I'm going to layer those right next to one another and pin those along the center. and then I will turn each side, flip it down or up, depends on what you want. You can, of course, flip these in many different ways, interbraid them. I've seen people do lots of different stuff with this. Again, this is a technique that everyone seems to discover at some point in their fashion design schooling journey. So it's definitely not something that I can lay any claim to, even though I have personally become quite re-enamored with it recently. I've used this sort of technique down the back several times now in different ways, but I just like the slightly skeletal, slightly spinal effect it adds. Because let's face it, if I can ever add just like a 10% creepiness level to a design, I want to. And you can stitch these down the center first. That is definitely an easier way of doing this. I'm just pinning them into place because I wasn't positive exactly how I wanted to pleat or twist or turn these, including down the very center itself. So I just have that pinned for now. And I'm going to turn up each side of these little ribbon bits, twisting each of these flattened tubes and pinning them into place, trying to give myself just a little bit of ease as I'm doing this so these stay puffy. I try not to cut these too short. I give myself a good at least 3/4 of an inch extra overhang on either side from where this will eventually be sandwiched down in the back princess seam. But you can see on the left hand side here I've already basted that side down, just running that through the machine, or at least you would be able to if you could pull your eyes away from the sleeping Oliver just inches away. Asleep on the job, and here you can see just how much extra in that twist I have left, extra little bit of puff and ease I have left in each of these strips so that they stand up away from the back. And I will baste down the other side as well, just turning my machine up to the largest stitch length. So I grabbed all the potential options for sequins and beads that might pair well with this fabric and started trying to come up with ideas on how exactly I wanted to add embellishment to this, because again, the metallic jacquard with the extra texture going on, why not add yet another texture with beads and sequins? Well, I'll tell you why not. A, because the camera has a really hard time focusing in on anything I'm doing over here at the sequining station, and B, I didn't really have the extra 2 or 3 days to spend on sequining this in order to get this video out in a timely manner. So naturally, instead of adhering to the schedule, I went ahead and dove into the embellishments anyhow. And for this back yoke piece, I ended up trying to create a kind of, again, raised vertebrae effect at the very center and extending that sequining out at an angle towards the shoulders on either side, again, trying to almost make it look like the skeletal system was crystallizing through the surface of the fabric, which is kind of maybe a gross idea, but I kind of like the idea of your bones radiating out through your skin and causing crystallization on your garments. What you can't see here is just how much I played around with different ideas for motifs, and I started off by thinking I would follow the patterning on the jacquard quite closely with sequins, but it's actually not a very large pattern, which would have resulted in me trying to use quite small sequins and beads to follow along with the various flooping and swirling of this pattern. And the smaller the beads and sequins, the more time it takes to sew on each curl of them by hand like this. And I will discuss the exact sequining techniques that I used for this particular project, and in addition to that, more about why you don't see me using a Luneville or a tambour embroidery method when I do my embellishments, because I do often get questions about that. I do have a tambour hook, I do know how to do tambour embroidery. However, I like the freedom of being off frame as opposed to having to stretch and frame up my fabric beforehand and get all the embellishment done before I construct the project. Having everything in mind and in place before I start constructing the garment, which I don't usually allow myself that much prep time, and I really do enjoy the freedom of being able to switch things up, add and subtract as I go when I'm already knee-deep into the project. Though unfortunately, even when I'm not sticking to using just size 15 seed beads and tiny 2mm sequins, even when I size things up, this process does still take quite a lot of time, and in the end, instead of the 2 days I had planned, this took me more like 7 to get all the embellishments done that I wanted to, especially with the frequent feline interruptions. So unfortunately, I must leave you today with a classic refrain, to be continued. And I even ran out of a few colors of the bits I was using, so I had to place an order, and I'm still waiting for a few more seed beads to arrive to finally finish up the last few lines of beadwork on this jacket. So unfortunately, I will have to finish up the embellishment and the assembly of this project with you in another video. We've been joined by Sophia. Thank you as always for watching today, and thank you so much to my patrons who make my work and these videos possible. Can you sit, please? Maybe? Try it. For me. No? And as always, I'll be back with more sewing, vintage fashion, costuming, crafting, and decorating real soon, so I'll see you then. Bye!